Hey everyone, have you ever looked at the news and just felt like global events are a chaotic random burst of noise? Like none of it makes sense? Well, what if it's actually not random at all? What if it's a highly structured, deliberate game of chess being played by the world's greatest empires? Today, we are mapping out exactly how this global chessboard is set up. And hey, if you want to understand the hidden rules that are actually driving global warfare and geopolitics, make sure you hit that subscribe button for Conflict Explained right now. It really helps us keep bringing you these deep dives. In today's explainer, we're breaking down a really incredible analytical framework from Professor Jiang. He maps out the grand strategies of major world powers, and it all culminates in a pretty shocking prediction about the 2028 US election. This framework isn't just some abstract theory. It's a lens to see exactly how the moves being made today dictate the global power dynamics of tomorrow.
Okay, let's dive into this by defining a really critical concept. Before we can understand the moves on the board, we need to understand what a grand strategy actually is. According to the framework we're exploring today, a grand strategy is a nation's long-term plan for how it sees itself in the world, and, more importantly, how it maintains control over time. It is the invisible hand guiding the daily headlines. It's the ultimate playbook that dictates every single military, economic, and political decision a country makes, rippling down to affect global markets and everyday citizens like you and me. Think of it kind of like the gravitational pull of an empire. Everything else, from a trade deal to a border skirmish, orbits around this one central strategy. Without understanding a nation's grand strategy, we are just looking at isolated, confusing events instead of a unified, terrifyingly logical whole.
Now, the source maps out these grand strategies using a fascinating metaphor, a game of chess. Think of the king as a nation's political system. This is the core foundation that absolutely must be protected, or the game is over. Then you have the queen. That is the grand strategy itself, the most versatile and powerful piece navigating the board. The vectors? Those are your attack tools, the rooks, knights, and bishops, used to actively strike and implement the strategy. These can be military, economic, or even technological. And finally, the pawns. These are the physical assets, the resources, or even allied nations that an empire is willing to sacrifice to achieve its ultimate geopolitical goals. In this global game, pawns are often entire regions or populations deployed strategically just to absorb the opening attacks of rival empires.
For this explainer, we are going to look at the board from 4 distinct angles. First, America's grand strategy. Second, Russia's Third Rome concept. Third, the Middle East players. And finally, we'll connect all of this to a deeply controversial prediction regarding emergency powers and the 2028 election.
All right, let's start with the player that currently holds the most dominant presence on the global board, the United States.
Let's see how this builds America's side of the board. The US king is its democracy. It's vibrant, it's wealthy, and it's highly creative. But according to our source, its ultimate vulnerability is extreme political polarization. Internal division is basically the quickest way to checkmate, because a paralyzed government cannot execute a long-term foreign policy. Now, the Queen, the grand strategy, is a combination of securing a fortress America at home while maintaining global dominance by managing chaos abroad. The vectors used to enforce this are unparalleled: absolute aerial supremacy, the sheer financial gravity of the US dollar, and a powerful global media reach that dictates the narrative. And the pawns? The source suggests these are American allies across Europe and East Asia, positioned essentially to absorb frontline pressures and keep adversaries bogged down far, far away from American shores.
So how does this queen actually move? Well, the source points directly to the official National Defense Strategy, which outlines a methodical 4-point program for imperial maintenance. First, totally secure the Western Hemisphere, making sure no near-peer rivals can establish a foothold close to home. Second, demand that allies step up and foot the bill for their own defense, which frees up American resources. Third, economically strangle China by controlling vital maritime choke points like the Strait of Malacca. This is absolutely crucial because a massive portion of global trade, including China's vital energy imports, flows directly through this tiny, narrow waterway. If you control the strait, you control the adversary's economic lifeblood. And fourth, aggressively supercharge the U.S. defense manufacturing base to prepare for prolonged global competition.
But you can't play chess alone, right? Let's shift our focus across the board to America's primary strategic opponent.
There is a fundamental difference between the two main players here. While the US king is a democracy, the Russian king is an autocracy. And the source notes that autocracy allows for incredibly decisive action, unified command, and multi-decade planning without the constant friction of polarized elections. They can commit to a grand strategy without worrying about midterm voter backlash. However, it carries a massive, fatal flaw. It is highly vulnerable to a succession crisis. If the autocrat falls,
falters, or simply ages out, there are rarely stable mechanisms for a peaceful transfer of power. Without a clear heir, the entire system risks collapsing overnight into messy internal power struggles, leaving the king entirely exposed. Russia's queen is driven by what the source calls the Third Rome strategy, which is this historical belief that Moscow is destined to unite the Christian Orthodox world. To implement this, Russia's vectors include its massive, almost unconquerable geography, a grueling land army built on superior artillery, and the deliberate construction of a Eurasian alliance with nations like China and Iran. The long-term goal here isn't just taking physical territory, it's to construct a massive, independent trading bloc that entirely bypasses the US dollar. If they successfully de-dollarize their economies, they effectively neutralize America's most powerful economic weapon, sanctions. Bypassing the dollar strips away American financial leverage and shifts the whole balance of global power, forcing the US to rely way more heavily on its military rather than its banks to project influence.
Now, the most active and explosive theater in this global game isn't in Washington or Moscow right now. It's in the Middle East. Let's pivot to these crucial regional powers. Israel's position on the board is highly unique. Their king operates as a mixed democracy and theocracy. They're highly creative and technologically advanced, but also internally divided by deep political factions. Their queen is identified by the source as the Greater Israel Project, which is a strategy aimed at expanding influence and securing unassailable regional dominance against hostile neighbors. Their primary vectors are the Mossad, arguably the most effective intelligence agency in the world, their global diaspora, and immense support from Christian Zionists abroad. Their pawns, according to this framework, include their deep integration into global IT infrastructure. By embedding their technological innovations into the global economy, they utilize tech influence as a shield, making themselves totally indispensable to the very nations that might otherwise try to pressure them diplomatically.
On the exact opposite side of this regional board is Iran. Their king is a strict theocracy, driven by fierce religious zeal, but vulnerable to alienating its own secular younger population. Their queen's strategy is to unite the Muslim world and entirely displace US-aligned powers in the region. Iran's vectors are actually particularly fascinating. Instead of relying primarily on a traditional centralized army, they employ what's called a mosaic strategy. This involves utilizing 31 decentralized armies and heavily armed proxy groups spread all across the region, like Hezbollah and the Houthis. You combine that with their impenetrable mountainous topography, which acts as a giant natural fortress, and highly cost-effective drone warfare, and this strategy is perfectly designed to drag opponents into a grueling, multi-front war of attrition that is just incredibly difficult to decisively defeat.
So we have all these grand strategies clashing simultaneously: America, Russia, Israel, Iran. But how does this immense, boiling foreign pressure cook the pot back home in the United States?
And this leads us to the absolute most provocative question raised in our source material. How does this intricate, global chess match directly affect the everyday domestic reality of the United States? And more specifically, how could it disrupt the 2028 election?
The source predicts a chilling chronological chain of events. It starts with the current conflict with Iran, dragging out into a grueling, forever war of attrition. To mathematically sustain this multi-front global strategy and maintain the American empire's footing, Step 2 is the U.S. instituting an automatic national draft. Step 3, the sheer scale of global conflict, leads the sitting president to invoke emergency war powers, asserting that the nation's survival is literally at stake. And finally, Step 4, under the pretext of this existential national emergency, the 2028 election is legally suspended or severely delayed, basically altering the entire fabric of American democracy to keep the king secure during wartime.
The source is highly specific about this. Professor Jiang states, Iran is under a forever war, and the United States will institute a national draft. The claim here is that men aged 18 to 24 will be automatically registered into the draft system to fight overseas. So for millions of American families, the geopolitical chess game suddenly becomes intensely personal. The logic presented here is just cold and mathematical. You simply cannot sustain a global grand strategy across multiple theaters without a massive, continuous influx of ground troops. When the pawns on the board run out, everyday citizens are called up to take their place on the front lines.
Now, you might be wondering, how does a delayed election even work legally? Well, the source points to a constitutional loophole, the use of emergency war powers. During times of existential national crises, the executive branch gains these extraordinary, sweeping authorities meant to ensure the continuity of government. The source neutrally compares this theoretical scenario to what Vladimir Zelensky has done in Ukraine, suspending elections entirely legally while the nation is under martial law and actively fighting a war for its survival. The argument is that the legal framework for a president to hit pause on the democratic process during a catastrophic war already exists here and could be activated if these grand strategies escalate into a full-blown global conflict.
Furthermore, the source outlines two highly unconventional pathways Donald Trump might take to secure a third term, completely bypassing the strict limits of the 22nd Amendment, which, legally restricts a president to serving only 2 terms. First, a really complex political maneuver running as vice president to a hand-picked surrogate, maybe someone like his son or another strict loyalist, who then immediately abdicates upon winning, theoretically elevating him back to the presidency without violating the 2-term election rule. Or second, the more dramatic route we just discussed, relying on a war-induced state of national emergency to legally stall the transfer of power indefinitely, using the global chaos on the chessboard to simply freeze the domestic political cycle.
It all leaves us with a profound question to ponder as we watch the nightly news unfold. Can domestic democratic institutions truly withstand the immense, crushing pressures of a global chess match? History shows us that when empires play out their grand strategies, the foundational rules at home are usually the very first pawns to be sacrificed. Thank you so much for watching this explainer. Keep your eyes on the board, and remember to subscribe to Conflicts Explain so you can keep analyzing the game with us. See you next time.